Chapter 9 Secrets of the Mangrove Forest. Next morning early, the outgoing tide saw me creeping into the mangroves, meat-hungry, eager, confident, savagely so. Knowing now in which direction to seek a creek, and progressing faster in a better understanding of how to walk upon the roots. Above all, knowing how to look for the fish, and I must learn how to spear them. At first peep of the pool, there was a dying ripple that faded into a pool of glass as I gazed. Some leisurely fish had just crossed. There was movement in the center of the pool, too. Right on the white bottom, a green crab large as a saucer, walking quickly sideways across to the sheltering roots, his nippers half erect as if expecting attack by a fish. None made a rush, though I held the spear ready. That pool in its silence and gloom might have been deep in some moonlit cavern where nothing lived save things of the water and mud. It was some time before I located the fin of the first fish. I speared and missed, and the pole broke with his fleeing ripples. When it whitened, I stepped like an anxious cat among the mangroves and up over the roots. To creep so above numbers of fish and not know how to see and spear them was heartbreaking. At last the magnetic attraction of a thing keenly sought brought my eyes staring straight down into the glassy, goggle eyes of a cod. He waited there directly below while I stealthily brought the spear to bear with absolute certainty. As its 4 points just tipped the surface of the water, sucked up to them. He did not even quiver to the movement. His unwinking eyes just glared up, his gills slowly pulsing, his big snub snout lying close against the root. Slowly trying to keep the arm from trembling, I lowered the prongs farther into the water until they seemed almost touching the fish, then lunged. A great splash, the feel of the spear deeply embedded, a laughing warmth of triumph. Not until the last ripple had died away and all was clear would I really believe the spear was embedded in the roots alone. It was bewildering. I had hunted with natives when they speared fish in river, lagoon, or the sea edge. They seldom had trees to guard against there, but then they had to throw a long way, and at swimming fish too, at the ripples as I thought then. But here I crouched above a pool barely 3 feet deep, and big fish would lie there absolutely moveless while I took the most accurate aim and missed. The sandflies allowed no brooding over disappointment. The cursed things were a constant misery of stinging bites in nostrils, ears, eyes, any part that could not be plastered with mud. The fish remained out of sight, thinking that in some other pool they would be undisturbed and possibly easier to see. I moved along. At both ends of this pool the root closed in to a narrow channel of mud, no sand or water. I jumped down and squelched slowly up through the mud. It was really a twisting channel-way, hedged on either side by roots. Presently there came the delightful gleam of water ahead, another pool, and fish were in it. But again I missed. All a man's canny maneuvering, his hungry caution, his fear of the tide rushing in before securing something to eat, were in vain, and might have been so for a further week but for that element luck, in this case doing the right thing in what was apparently the wrong way. As a big white cod came swimming leisurely beneath, I lunged desperately downward, certain the spear would not reach within a foot of his tail. Instantly the spear was almost wrenched away as in laughing glee I kept my weight hard down on the haft. I had speared my first fish, and how he kicked and wrenched and splashed, holding the spear Firmly, I reached one hand down for his head, got a firm grip of the big gills, pulled out the spear, and lifted the prize out of the water. Instantly, the big cod doubled up, then straightened taut like a released steel strap, his needle-sharp teeth lacerating my fingers. Another powerful jerk, and he splashed the water and was gone. The creek had crept into a shiny, snaky line. It was a live thing, imperceptibly growing and snaking along and spreading. Then came the whisperings, the gurglings, and eerie sounds deep in among the mangroves before. In haste, I sighted the next fish. With wits driven by necessity, were working sharply. That last fish had been speared when I felt certain the thrust would land a foot behind its tail. That might account for missing the others. Perhaps there was something deceptive in the water. The fish might not be where it appeared to be. The fellow visible now was a big flat fish with a tiny tail. Just another shot before the tide swirled in. I aimed carefully a foot length behind the fish and lunged down. With intense delight I felt its struggling plunges, vibrating the spear, as leaping into the water I pressed the haft, pinning the fish to the bottom. The body twisted up as with a resounding flop the fish was gone, carrying the spear prongs with him. A 6-inch wave of water came hurrying straight up the creek, its flanks behind spreading out among the roots right and left. Across mud flats, unseen among the trees, little rushing waves were spreading with a growing, sucking sound. In wrathful misery, I hurried away through the mangrove trees, chased by the tide. Charlie was at the camp, just sitting down to a fat meal of fish. He merely kept on eating with no greeting and no invitation. I mixed up some flour and water, kneaded it into a johnny cake, and slung it on the coals. Then took a long galley hook and began making another spear. But a much more careful, more efficient job this was. I turned the johnny cake, and the leathery stuff, when it was brushed the charcoal off it, and ate the leathery stuff, washing it down with the last of my share of the tea, the leaves of which had been brewed several times before. Then in a much better temper I turned again to the spear and worked into it a sort of eager triumph, thinking eagerly of the morrow. For now I knew how to detect and to aim and to thrust to spear a fish. As to holding and securing him when once impaled, well, that would solve itself. Anyway, all the fish could not be so big and strong and slimy as those already speared. Sundown was coming before the spear was finished, a very poor spear from an aboriginal point of view. Still it was a strong spear, a spear that would hold its prey. The lessons of failure and fright of hunger were woven into that weapon. I balanced it and walked down towards the well, wishing it were next day with the tide out. It was starting to drift out now, but would not leave the mangroves dry until long after dark. Still, there being nothing else to do, and nowhere else to go, some instinct even against the sandflies urged me towards the partially exposed reef. Near the edge, a shoal of brilliantly hued parrotfish were racing home. They were very beautiful, big and fat too. I longed for a throw, but was utterly useless. It meant a throw, not a jab, and even if a fish were impaled, he would race into deep water and the spear would be lost. Also, there were some ominous black fins hovering near the edge of the deep water. Something slithered as I stood stock still with tingling feet. A green crab the size of a small dinner plate, champing enormous claws, scampered from a shallow pool and made straight for the mangroves. I was after it instantly, stabbing again and again. With almost human agility, it dodged, clashing its great snippers at the quick spear prongs. It fought for its life, dodging with incredible cunning, and actually reached the mangroves with me, stabbing now in a wild despair. It was slithering across a gnarled root when a final lunge drove the 4 prongs through the hard shell back. In foolish delight, I stooped, but those nippers clashed like castanets and hairbreadth below my fingers, and a flash memory told how natives manipulate giant crabs. As I gingerly reached behind the thing's head, although impaled, it tried desperately to reach its claws over its back, but it could only reach a certain distance. One sharp sideways jerk and each claw in turn was detached from its body. This meal was secure, although intensely delighted. I looked back and went carefully over every detail of the little drama. Necessity is a painstaking teacher. From the exposed reef where it had been fishing, that crab had fought its way back to the mangroves and almost entered a hole dug in the coral. Under the mangrove roots, a surprising hole like a young rabbit burrow, there was a ledge of dead coral here in place 3 feet high, running along the inland reef edge of the mangrove roots. Those claws must be of enormous power to dig holes in stone. Dead coral is really hard, brittle stone. At a slithering rattle, I wheeled around to see a large blue crab diving sideways into another hole. A delightful sight. There appeared to be a number of holes dug in the coral just above high water mark. The hunting lust fairly surged within me as I peered about. Poking halfway out of the mouths of their holes, several big crabs were cautiously watching as I wheeled around at another rattling and saw 5 whopper crabs scuttling in alarm for their burrows. As I sprang towards them, the hard shell of their bodies rattled over the loose corals. In a few minutes I'd speared several big chaps, and soon there with spear upraised, glaring around for others, just wild with the successful hunt lust. All thoughts of evening of everything were entirely blotted out, but crabs possess cunning or instinct. They vanished except one belated chap scuttling down his burrow. And night had come in earnest. That was a glorious meal. I offered Charlie a share. When he just scowled and turned his head away, I laughed. Fortunately, I'd seen the aboriginals cooking crabs and knew the poisonous parts to throw away. That meal was truly delicious, the huge claws full of sweet meat. Always afterwards the crabs were our meat, the fish were fish.